we find that when Hashem refers to the patriarchs, he refers to them and he speaks about them. He refers to them as Elokei Avraham. He refers to the relationship, I am the God of Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. What is the meaning? That God is the God of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. What does that mean? As we discussed, that before the Mishkan was built, where was God's location in existence? That wherever the patriarchs were, God's presence was there at that location. Meaning they were so removed from evil, they were so pure and so holy that they were the equivalent of the Holy of Holies. Therefore, God's presence could be associated with them. And that's the meaning of Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Avraham. However, the Midrash tells us that God does not associate his name with any human being until he's no longer alive. And it's based on the verse. The verse says, it's a verse in Tehillim, L'kedoshim she'ba'oretz hema. God only has relevance to the Kedoshim who are in that land already, meaning they're in the world to come. Emosai Kedoshim. When the tzaddikim, one of the devoutly righteous considered, classified as Kedoshim, as holy, Kshen Kfurim Baretz, when they're buried in the ground, that's the one they're considered Kedoshim. But until they're buried in the ground, they're not considered Kedoshim. What does that mean? The Rambam writes that a person, even if he's evil all his life, until the last moment of his existence, if he should repent at that last moment, his negative record is totally blotted out. And when he ascends to be evaluated and judged, there's no mention of that negative record whatsoever. And therefore, a person is able to do tshuva till the last breath of his existence. But it's true to the contrary. If a person is a devoutly righteous tzaddik his whole life, and he espoused Judaism, influenced people, but before he leaves this world, the last moment, he makes a statement. He says, I regret that I ever did any mitzvah. I ever did any good deed. I don't want to identify with it to any degree. If he makes that kind of declaration, not one of his good deeds are mentioned on the day of judgment. His record is totally obliterated. It goes either way. If it's negative, tshuva could delete the whole negative record. And if a person makes a declaration of rejection, he rejects that life. He doesn't want it. Although his whole life was fully invested, it's wiped out. So even the patriarchs, what we call them the Avos HaKadosh, the holy patriarchs, as long as they were alive, they still had free choice. Free choice means you could choose, God forbid, to go out the door and go off the cliff. And you could also choose to ascend that ladder, even beyond where you were at. That's until the last moment of your existence. If God would associate his name with the person when he's still alive, what would be if that person, God forbid, the last moment, should change directions and he chooses to reject God? I mean, God already has associated his name with that person. So God's locked into a situation where the person may turn to be evil. Therefore, when are they considered Kedoshim Asher Ba'aretz? Once they're dead and buried, with there's no going back because the person is no longer alive, only then does God associate his name with those people. And this includes the holy patriarchs, even the Avos HaKadoshim. That's the Midrash. Shekol zman she'en chayim. As long as the patriarchs were alive, God does not identify, allow his name to be exclusively upon them. Why? Because God doesn't believe in them. They say you believe in a person. God doesn't believe in anyone in terms of, because that immediately infringes on free choice. Everybody, whatever level you're at, you're vulnerable to the distraction and the hoodwinking of the evil inclination. The Kevin Mason, but once these tzaddikim, these valid righteous people die, then God allows his name to be associated with them. This is his person. And for eternity, that person identifies with God or God identifies with him. But as long as you are that you're subject to the evil inclination and his value and purpose is to mislead you, and you still have that choice, you never know. God forbid, a person could somehow embrace that position. And if he does, he's no longer the tzaddik. So we have a problem. Because Yitzchak Avinu, God associates its name with Yitzchak even before he passes away. God allowed his name to be associated with Yitzchak even before he passed away. Where do we find this? Omer Yaakov. Yaakov now is fleeing to Choron. He's fleeing from the clutches of his brother. And Hashem says to Yaakov, who am I? Elokei Avraham Avicha. I am the God of your father Avram, meaning grandfather, Elokei Yitzchak. And I am the God of Yitzchak. That's his father. And Yitzchak's still alive. But if we say that God doesn't want to associate his name with a person, as long as he's subject to the evil inclination, because you never know in what direction he may go. So how does God associate his name with Yitzchak, although Yitzchak's still alive? That's the question of the Midrash. Could you imagine? Avraham Avinu introduced monotheism to all humanity. He gave his life for it. He went to the kill and he came out of the kill. Every fiber of his being was only to magnify God's presence. Even Avraham, as great as he was, and he already withstood the 10 tests, God would not associate his name with Avraham, that he should refer to as Elokei Yitzchak Avraham until Avraham passed away. Because everybody has choice till the last moment of their existence. And you never know what direction you go. You could be holier than thou in the reality. And in one moment, you could be toppled from the top of the mountain all the way to the bottom of the mountain. Even Avraham, Yitzchak was not his father. And yet, God associates his name with Yitzchak even before Yitzchak passes away. That's the Midrash's question. There's an expression. It may be improbable, but it's not impossible. When it comes to the evil inclination, there's no such thing as impossible, God forbid. He's given the power to seduce you, to influence you, to mislead you, regardless who you are. And he's able to succeed. It's all up to you. That's choice. That's free choice. Including Avram. But yet, God refers to Yitzchak when he's alive, and he identifies him as Elokei Yitzchak. I am Elokei Yitzchak. So the Midrash gives two answers. Reb Rechia gives one answer, and the Chachamim give another answer. Rabban and Amri, Ro es afro kilu tzover al gabi mizbeach. We know the Akedah was the greatest challenger of Avraham, and he succeeded. The Torah goes out of its way to tell us that Avraham took a ram that was caught in the thicket, and he brought the ram in the place of Yitzchak, his son. Those are the words of the Torah. What does that mean? That every aspect of service with that ram, he said, let it be valued as if it's my son being slaughtered. Let it be valued as if I'm receiving his blood. Let it be valid as if I'm sprinkling his blood. Let it be valued as if I'm burning his remains. Chazal tell us, and we refer to this on Rosh Hashanah, davening, God sees the ash of Yitzchak piled before his eyes. What do you mean you see the ash of Yitzchak piled before your eyes? Yitzchak never died. He was never killed. He was never burnt. The answer is that since Avraham, when he brought that ram, he infused it in every intention he had that he would slaughter Yitzchak and do whatever the ritual of service is. It's valued as if Yitzchak himself was actually burnt and sacrificed. Therefore, what is Yitzchak's value? What is his classification? His classification is he's a heap of ash piled before God's eyes. That if there's ever a prosecution against the Jewish people by Satan, that pile of ash before God's eyes, which represents Avram's selfless dedication to God, that silences Satan, that he can't prosecute. So what the Midrash is saying, it's not just a depiction due to his, but factually, because Yitzchak could have been and should have been, and Avram's intention was, Yitzchak has no evil inclination. It's like he was incinerated, as if he was burnt, but he's alive. Being alive only happens to be his circumstance, but his essence, what he represents, he already accomplished it. He accomplished whatever his life was meant to be, and therefore he no longer has an evil inclination. That's the first opinion in the Midrash. Therefore, since he's like considered as if he's no longer alive, although he is alive, God associates his name with him because he's no longer subject to the evil inclination. That's the first opinion. That's the Chachamim. Reb Brechi says, now this is very interesting. Yitzchak was blind. He became blind. The Talmud tells us that Iva Choshev Kemes, Suma Choshev Kemes, the person's blind, it's like you're dead. You're a dead man. Why? Because what are considered the brokers of the heart? What draws us to temptation? What draws us to sin? The visual. When we see things, as we say, seeing is believing. Seeing is a quantification of reality of everything. So when our heart lusts, our eyes seek out. But if a person, God forbid, is blind, the person lusts nothing. The person like withers within himself. As a result of this, the Midrash tells us it's as if he was no longer alive. Because he was confined to the house, and the evil inclination ceased to have any influence on him because he was confined to the house. So now the obvious question is, first was saying the reason why he was not subject to the evil inclination is because he was blind. Because that he doesn't have the visual, he can't visualize things, therefore he's not subject. And it says, and because he was confined to the house, because he was blind, therefore the evil inclination ceased affecting his life. How do we understand this? Now, the first human being ever to sin was Adam. His wife sees the fruit of the tree of knowledge. It's beautiful. It's attractive. She's drawn to it and she eats it. Then she offers it to him. And God says, because you partook of the fruit that you were not permitted to partake, you'll be subject to death. You'll be driven out of the Garden of Eden. There were other consequences. So the question is, before Adam ingested the fruit of tree of knowledge, which is evil, why was he tempted? If temptation is an inner drive, an inner need to be satisfied, why was he drawn to the tree of knowledge? As beautiful as it was, the fruit, as attractive it was, The answer is the two evil inclinations. Evil inclinations could get you in one of two ways. Every human being, due to the ingestion of the evil of tree of knowledge, we have the foreign substance within us which draws us to sin. Every human being has a natural sexual drive. Every human being has a natural drive to amass wealth because wealth is power. That's natural. You don't need the external to activate that desire. You may whet the person's appetite when he's exposed to it, but he naturally gravitates to certain areas. Then you have another situation. Because you see certain things, that's called an external evil inclination. We see things in a certain attractive context, almost overwhelmingly desirable. So the visual draws us to do that. Although Adam himself in his innate being was pure, because no evil was intermingled in his being, but he still had visual capability. When he saw that fruit and he understood what it represents, he couldn't control himself. That's called evil inclination, which is outside the person. And there's the evil inclination, which is embedded within us, which draws us to these things. Adam had no evil inclination within himself. It was only outside of himself. When he saw the tree of knowledge, he saw the beauty of the fruit, the value of the fruit, the potential of fruit, that drew him there. See, he wasn't drawn due to something internal, but rather something which was external. Yitzchak himself, because we see him as a burnt offering, God sees him as a heap of ash. What's a heap of ash? Heap of ash has no evil inclination because the person doesn't exist. The person has lost his identity. Then it continues. And in addition, he was sequestered in his home. And that's why the evil inclination no longer had any control over him. Is it because he was turned to ash, or is it because he was sequestered in his home? So the way I think what the Midrash is telling us, although he no longer had the inner evil inclination, drawing him to many things, because he's blind, what about the external evil inclination? We smell things, we see, we hear things. We become aware of things. That's the external. That's the external evil inclination. So since when Yitzhak became blind, he was sequestered in his home, he was confined to his home, he did not have the evil inclination, the external one. And because he didn't have the external one, it was impossible for him to sin. Internally, he was the equivalent of non-existent because he was blind. In addition, what about the external draw to come out? You could be drawn out. The answer is there's nothing to draw him out because he was confined to the house. When he was blind, he didn't go out. As a result of that, there wasn't a chance he could have sinned, and therefore God associates his name with Yitzchak before he actually passes away from this world. That's the understanding. It's something which is not to be understood. We said that Avraham, until he was circumcised, his name was Avraham. The numerical value of Avraham is 243. When he was circumcised, he became Avraham. Numerical value of Avraham is 248, which correspond to every aspect of his being. Until he was circumcised, he had no control over his eyes, his ears, and his male organ. Meaning, it was possible he would notice things which were inappropriate. He would hear things that were inappropriate. After he was circumcised, when he had the additional letter added to his name, now he's in full control of his being. full control. His eyes naturally shut down when he sees anything inappropriate. His ears turn deaf if he's exposed to lashon hara or falsehood. And his procreative organ only has relevance to something which is totally permitted. He was totally spiritualized through the circumcision. So if he's totally spiritualized through the circumcision, so what do you mean? God doesn't trust even the holiest. But you just finished telling he has control. Control means it's within your control, but it doesn't mean to say that you can't fail. And if you can even fail even once, God says, you're not eligible to have my name associated with you. That means the sinner, God is associated with the sinner. God says that can't be, will not be. Yitzchak, that it was impossible he should sin. Internally, externally, as a result of it, that's why God associated his name with Yitzchak even before he passed away for that reason. We find that a non-Jew is only bound to the 7 Noahide laws. A Jew has 248 positive commandments, 365 negative commandments. Why do we have so many more commandments? The answer is because we have a different dimensional soul, and therefore, to protect the soul from not being compromised, the 365 areas which a person has to be careful not to cross those lines. Otherwise, he will compromise his spirituality. The 248 positive commandments, if you want to advance it, you engage in these areas of advancement. The non-Jew doesn't have it. Why not? If it's beneficial, it becomes more spiritualized, let the non-Jew do it. The answer is that if a person is handicapped and you don't have the keenness of understanding and sense, guaranteed you will fail. It doesn't even, you don't stand the chance. Therefore, the non-Jew was never endowed with that special spirituality because he doesn't have the level of keenness and clarity to be able to address all those issues. Therefore, it's limited to 7 Noahide laws, all negative commandments, the don't do's. The only do is setting up a judicial system to adjudicate or prosecute the violator. But in terms of the bulk of what the Noahide laws are, don't cross lines. That's what it's about. But it's limited to those 7. And we're talking about fundamental murder, eating a limb off a living animal, which is like barbarism, cursing God, God forbid. That's something else. Yitzchak definitely was hoodwinked by his son, Esau. He deceived him. And the Midrash quotes a verse in Mishlei, in Proverbs, Evan Chein Hashochad, Beni Bolov. So the Midrash explains bribery is the equivalent if you have a large stone. Wherever it falls, it creates damage. It smashes, it breaks. Esau, what did he do? He gave his father food to eat. That food was the equivalent of bribery. Yitzchak became blinded to all the shortcomings of Esau. because he physically was a beneficiary of Esav's trappings. Although he behaved in a certain way unconsciously, and he could have seen maybe, but the moment you're bribed, you don't see anything. You don't see anything negative, and you come to defend him. Okay, I think we'll stop here on the recording.